We're counting down the 15 British meals that vanished after the 80s, a journey through the comfort foods, working-class staples, and beloved pub classics that disappeared as fast food, health trends, and supermarket convenience reshaped British kitchens. From lunchbox legends and chippy favorites to home-cooked, thrifty mainstays, each entry on this list showcases a dish that once defined an era, but slowly faded from plates and menus. Some vanished overnight thanks to new laws, others declined with changing tastes, or vanished simply because life sped up. You won't believe which childhood classics failed to survive, and number 7 might stun you most. Let's begin our countdown with a lunchtime platter you may remember from your local pub. Number 15. The plowman's lunch once reigned as the midday king of the British pub. A slab of crumbly cheddar, thick-sliced crusty bread, a wedge of apple, and a tangle of pickled onions. Simple, unfussy, and perfectly suited to a pint and a sunny beer garden. In the late 1970s, pub surveys placed the plowman's in the top 10 most ordered items, its appeal rooted in thrift and tradition. But as the 1980s rolled on, fast food chains doubled their lunchtime trade, and the arrival of plastic-wrapped sandwiches and meal deals began to crowd out the old pub classics. By the year 2000, fewer than 3% of pub menus featured a true plowman's lunch, according to trade surveys. Landlords watched as regulars swapped cheese boards for chips in a box, and the midday ritual of bread and cheese faded to a rare treat. The plowman's never vanished overnight, but its slow retreat from the lunch crowd marked the first quiet casualty of Britain's changing daytime appetite. Number 14, pork pie, was once the undisputed champion of the British picnic basket and the working lunch. A golden-crusted round filled with seasoned pork and encased in a thick layer of jelly, it traveled well. No cutlery needed, no fuss, no refrigeration. In school lunchboxes and on tartan blankets, pork pies sat beside hard-boiled eggs and apples, their solidity a promise against hunger. But by the mid-1990s, supermarket chillers brimmed with neatly packaged sandwiches, each one boasting exotic fillings and plastic-wrapped convenience. The 1994 IGD report recorded sandwich sales soaring by 18% year-on-year, while pork pie sales tumbled by 12%, the sharpest drop in decades. A picnic survey comparing 1980 with 2000 showed a threefold decrease in pies making the trip to the park. The change was quiet but relentless. Retailers gave more shelf space to meal deals, and the pork pie, once a symbol of British portability and thrift, became a rare sight outside Christmas buffets and heritage bakeries. Number 13. Cod roe on toast once filled the gap between breakfast and lunch in coastal towns and city fish shops. A thick smear of pale pink roe, gently steamed or tinned, spread across hot, buttered slices, never fancy, but unmistakably briny. Fishmongers kept trays of cod roe behind glass, a cheap protein for workers who stopped in before a shift, or mothers stretching the week's shopping. The Seafish Industry Authority tracked cod roe retail volumes tumbling by 85% from 1975 to 2005, a collapse mirrored in the emptying chiller cabinets of high street fishmongers. As tastes shifted toward cod fillets and later salmon, the sight of roe on toast faded from cafe counters. Children balked at the look, calling it fishy jam, while older customers defended its gentle saltiness and the way it paired with milky tea. Today, cod roe survives in sushi bars and Scandinavian jars, but the British version rarely appears outside specialist shops, a reminder of when the fishmonger shaped the weekday menu. Number 12. Saveloy and pea soup once stood as a familiar partnership behind the glass counters of the British fish and chip shop. The bright red Saveloy, a seasoned sausage, steamed or sometimes fried, waited alongside vats of thick, steaming pea soup, a pairing that offered quick warmth on a damp evening. In the years after the war, regional chippies from London to the southeast made space for this duo, with National Federation of Fish Fryers records from 1960 noting the combination on nearly half of surveyed shop menus. The soup, made from dried marrow-fat peas and a ham bone, if luck allowed, filled mugs as customers queued for their Friday treat. But as the decades turned, chip shops faced pressure to serve faster and cheaper. By the turn of the millennium, menu standardization swept aside slower sellers, and the Saveloy and pea soup pairing faded to a rarity. Less than 5% of chippies still offered it by 2000, according to trade surveys. Today, the pairing survives mostly in memory, a casualty of operational efficiency and the slow retreat of regional character from the high street takeaway. Number 11. Pork scratchings once ruled the bar top like a salty monarch, their crunch echoing through smoky tap rooms. Every pint came with a paper packet, grease spots spreading across the wood, the scent of fried rind mingling with stale ale and laughter. Landlords stacked jars behind the pumps, some so old the contents had fused into a single fossilized block. For decades, scratchings were the pub snack. Cheap, bracing, unapologetically fatty, and perfectly matched to bitter beer. But the late 1980s brought a new era. Licensing reforms in 1988 opened the door to longer hours and stricter food safety rules. Health inspectors frowned at open jars and greasy fingers, insurance premiums climbed, and publicans faced new pressure to swap scratchings for nuts or baked crisps. The campaign for real ale found that by 1992, nearly a third of pubs had dropped scratchings from their offerings. Supermarket snack aisles followed suit, with sales falling by 40% through the 1990s as low-fat and baked snacks took over. Still, for those who remember, pork scratchings remain a symbol of the old pub. Cheeky, dangerous, and just a little bit rebellious, now mostly confined to specialty shops and nostalgia packs. Number 10. Chipped beef on toast belonged to the age of rationing, when the Ministry of Food urged families to stretch every ounce of protein. Thin shavings of preserved beef, often tinned, sometimes dried, were stirred into a white sauce and poured over stale bread, turning scraps into a meal that felt heartier than it was. In 1946, canned meats accounted for 22% of the nation's protein intake, a figure that plummeted to just 2% by 1985, as fresh meat returned to shop windows and household budgets recovered. The taste was salty, the texture sometimes rubbery, but for many, it carried the memory of wartime kitchens where ingenuity mattered more than flavor. Post-war surveys show that by the 1950s, nearly every pantry held at least one tin of preserved meat, a hedge against shortages. Yet as the decades rolled on, the idea of meat from a can grew less appealing. By the late 1980s, chipped beef on toast had become a relic, eclipsed by the promise of fresh cuts and the stigma attached to emergency food. The dish's quiet disappearance speaks to a broader shift, from the pride of making do to the embarrassment of being seen as behind the times, as prosperity brought new expectations to the British table. Number 9. Rice pudding. Once ended countless school dinners with a warm, sweet finish. In lunch halls across the country, rows of metal trays held thick, creamy pudding, the skin browned and bubbling, a dusting of nutmeg curling at the edges. For many, it was the taste of comfort. Simple, filling, and endlessly adaptable to whatever milk or sugar rationing allowed. Housewives had their own ways. Some stirred in a spoonful of jam, others left the grains just undercooked for a bit of bite. Yet the pudding's fate changed with the Department of Education's 1981 nutritional guidance. New policies swept through canteens, urging less fat, less sugar, and more modern desserts. The Leeds Local Education Authority's menu audit recorded a 70% reduction in rice pudding servings between 1982 and 1985. Dinner ladies, some with decades of service, recall the protests. Children missing the familiar bowl, staff quietly lamenting the loss of a dish that could stretch pennies and fill bellies. The shift marked more than a menu change. It signaled the end of an era when pudding was as much about ritual as nutrition. Rice pudding survives in home kitchens, but its everyday place in childhood faded, replaced by chilled yogurts and mousse in plastic pots. What was once a staple became a rare comfort, its memory lingering in the scent of milk and spice on a cold afternoon. Number 8. Bubble and Squeak turned leftovers into legend. Sunday's roast potatoes and cabbage, mashed together and fried until crisp at the edges, filled the kitchen with a sizzle that signaled thrift and satisfaction. The name itself, Bubble for the sound, Squeak for the cabbage, became a shorthand for making do, a meal built from what remained rather than what was bought. Housewives, facing tight budgets and little waste, relied on Bubble and Squeak to stretch the week's food, with potatoes at just 4 pence per pound providing the backbone. In 1980, household surveys found nearly 2/3 of families cooked some version of it by Monday night, a testament to the skill of turning scraps into supper. Yet by 1985, the arrival of the microwave and the rise of ready meals changed everything. A national survey reported 60% of households had fewer leftovers to use at all. The new kitchen prized speed, not ingenuity. Bubble and Squeak faded from the dinner table as the art of reusing became less necessary, and the quiet pride of waste, not cooking, slipped away. Children who once wrinkled noses at fried cabbage grew up in homes where leftovers meant plastic trays, not a second meal. Still, the memory lingers in the hiss of a pan and the golden crust that formed when thrift met patience. Bubble and Squeak's disappearance marks more than a lost recipe. It signals the vanishing of a generation's kitchen wisdom. Number 7. Toad in the Hole stood proudly among winter dishes, though its ingredients were modest. Sausages baked in Yorkshire pudding batter created a dinner that filled plates without demanding much meat. Housewives knew how to stretch half a pound of sausages, costing around 1 shilling and sixpence in 1960, into enough for a family of 6, once encased in batter. The sizzling fat pooled at the base of the tin, crisping the edges while the middle stayed soft and spongy, perfect for soaking up onion gravy. Children often fought over the brown corners. Fathers claimed the sausages first, and mothers quietly ensured no piece of batter went to waste. The National Food Survey of 1962 recorded sausage consumption at nearly 1.5 pounds per person weekly, confirming their role as the most accessible meat in working-class diets. Yet by 1990, that figure had dropped to just over half a pound, as leaner cuts and chicken replaced the old pork links. Quality varied sharply. Butcher's sausages carried proper seasoning, while cheaper factory ones shrank into pale stubs that barely filled the pudding. School dinner versions made from bulk sausages often collapsed into soggy disappointment, leaving children unimpressed. Still, the dish endured because it solved the winter dilemma, a cheap, warm supper that left bellies full even when meat was scarce. It was never fancy, but when nights grew long and wages short, Toad in the Hole felt like abundance. Number 6. Rabbit stew belonged to the countryside, where thrift and local know-how shaped the meal. For generations, it simmered in farmhouse kitchens, wild rabbit jointed and browned with onions, carrots, a sprig of thyme from the hedgerow, and just enough water to stretch the meat to feed a family. The scent of slow-cooked rabbit and root vegetables drifted through stone cottages, a reminder that the land itself could fill the pot when wages or rations ran thin. Yet by the 1980s, this dish had already begun to slip into memory. Urbanization pulled families away from fields and hedges, and with the decline of small butchers, even rural cooks struggled to source fresh rabbit. In 2020, the Devon Women's Institute held a rabbit stew cook-off, only to find that not a single local butcher could supply wild rabbit. Organizers resorted to farmed imports, a quiet sign of how much had changed. Licensing and food safety rules never truly blocked rabbit from the table. Instead, it was the slow erosion of rural habits, the loss of neighbors who knew how to skin and joint, and a squeamishness about wild game that grew as Britain urbanized. Rabbit stew, once a symbol of making do, now lingers mostly in the stories of those who remember gathering herbs from the verge and simmering supper with what the land provided. The dish's quiet vanishing speaks not just to changing tastes, but to the fading of a countryside rhythm that shaped British kitchens for centuries. Number 5. Beef Wellington once stood as the undisputed showpiece of the British celebration table, a dish reserved for Christmas, anniversaries, or the rare Sunday when time and money allowed for something truly grand. The ritual began with a thick cut of beef fillet, seared and cooled, then wrapped in a layer of mushroom duxelle and delicate ham, all sealed inside a golden, buttery pastry. The preparation demanded hours of careful work, chilling, rolling, basting, and precise timing to ensure the pastry stayed crisp while the beef remained pink. Its arrival at the table was a moment. Knives poised, conversation hushed, each slice revealing concentric rings of meat and pastry, the aroma of mushrooms and butter mingling in the air. In the 1970s, home cooks could find beef Wellington in nearly every major British cookbook. But by the late 1980s, the Good Housekeeping Recipe Index recorded a 70% drop in home beef Wellington instructions. The dish became a victim of its own grandeur, too costly, too fiddly, and too risky for a weekday or even most weekends. As microwaves and ready meals promised dinner in minutes, the idea of devoting an entire afternoon to pastry and fillet became unthinkable for most. Restaurants and gastropubs took up the mantle, offering Wellington as a luxury for special nights out, but the domestic ritual quietly vanished. What was once a family's crowning achievement, proof of patience, skill, and celebration, retreated behind kitchen doors, leaving only the memory of that first perfect slice shared at the table. Number 4. Findus crispy pancakes were the frozen treat that turned Tuesday tea into an event. The box in the freezer, with its bright orange lettering and cartoon sizzle, promised a meal ready in minutes. No peeling, no pans, just a whiff of anticipation as the oven timer ticked down. Inside, a thin, golden crust wrapped around fillings like minced beef or gooey cheese and ham, each one oozing out the moment you took a bite. For children of the 1980s, the sound of that crackling shell was as familiar as the jingle from the television adverts, which peaked in 1985 with a staggering £8 million campaign. Findus knew exactly what they were selling: freedom for busy parents, excitement for hungry kids, and the thrill of eating something you'd seen on TV. The ads showed families laughing around the table, a world away from the slow rituals of home-cooked pies and bubbling stews. By the mid-80s, the Findus pancake had become a cultural shorthand for convenience, the badge of a modern household embracing the future. Yet the very qualities that made them a sensation, speed, uniformity, the promise of no fuss, also signaled the decline of the old kitchen traditions. Home cooks who once spent Sundays rolling pastry or slow-cooking mince watched as their skills were replaced by a box and a beep. When Findus discontinued the classic line in 2016, nostalgia surged, but the moment had passed. Supermarkets tried to revive the pancake, but the magic was gone. The taste belonged to a time when frozen food meant progress, not compromise. For many, the memory of crispy pancakes is inseparable from the era's optimism. A golden pocket of childhood now vanished from the freezer aisle as British mealtimes moved further from the stove and closer to the microwave. Number 3. Steak and kidney pie once anchored both the family supper table and the pub counter, its golden crust hiding a filling of slow-cooked beef and soft, yielding kidney in thick, peppery gravy. The aroma rising from the oven, rich with onions and the faint tang of offal, spoke of a meal that rewarded patience and thrift. National Food Survey figures reveal a startling shift. Between 1975 and 1985, the frequency of home-cooked pies like steak and kidney dropped by 55%, a collapse mirrored in the changing layout of the British supermarket. By 1982, a Tesco internal memo ordered butcher counters to shrink their offerings of stewing beef and kidneys, reallocating shelf space to chilled ready meals and convenience pies. The old ritual, selecting meat from the butcher, dicing suet for pastry, simmering filling for hours, gave way to foil trays and microwave instructions. Families who once gathered for a homemade pie found themselves reaching for boxes in the chiller cabinet, the promise of speed and uniformity outbidding tradition. Pub menus, too, began to favor reheated slices over pies baked on the premises. The disappearance was not sudden, but relentless. A slow migration from butcher's block to supermarket shelf, from Sunday centerpiece to a memory of steam rising as the first wedge was cut. The pie's decline foreshadowed a broader retreat of home-cooked classics, as supermarket strategy and the demand for convenience redrew the boundaries of the British kitchen. Steak and kidney pie survives in gastropubs and heritage cookbooks, but the days when its making marked a household's skill and care have largely slipped away, setting the stage for the regulatory shocks that would soon follow. Number 2, faggots and peas once stood as a badge of Midlands thrift and ingenuity, a dish born from the offcuts and offal that butchers couldn't sell, transformed into something hearty enough to anchor a weekday supper. Minced pig's liver, heart, and lungs, mixed with breadcrumbs and herbs, rolled into balls and baked until the fat bubbled and the crust turned sticky brown. The aroma, rich, slightly sweet, unmistakably earthy, filled kitchens from Birmingham to the Black Country, where butchers' guilds recorded faggots accounting for nearly a fifth of all hot food sales in the 1970s. At the chippy, or the pub, faggots arrived swimming in onion gravy, flanked by a heap of mushy peas, the green a sharp contrast to the dark, dense meat. For many, the texture divided opinion. Children wrinkled noses at the sight of soft offal, while older generations prized the dish as a taste of hard times survived and overcome. Yet by the close of 1989, the entire tradition teetered on the edge of extinction. The bovine offal prohibition regulations, rushed into law that November in the shadow of the BSE crisis, banned the use of brains, spinal cords, and other specified organs in human food. Butchers' Guild minutes from the early 1990 capture the shock, an 80% fall in faggot sales reported almost overnight, with long-standing suppliers forced to halt production or face prosecution. The regulations, meant to protect public health, swept away not only the feared cuts, but also the economic lifeline for small butchers and pie makers. Supermarkets, already wary of controversy, delisted faggots and all offal-based pies from their shelves, accelerating the collapse. Pub menus followed suit, quietly erasing faggots and peas in favor of safer, standardized offerings. The loss was more than culinary. In towns where faggots had once been a Friday treat, the ban signaled the end of a culture that found value in every part of the animal. The dish's disappearance was swift, driven by law rather than taste. A regulatory shock that left butchers, dinner ladies, and families alike mourning the vanishing of a meal that had survived wars, rationing, and decades of social change. Today, faggots linger only in the rare specialist butcher's window, or the odd festival, a reminder of how quickly a centuries-old staple can vanish when the law turns against it. And finally, in first place, jellied eels stand as the most haunting loss from the British table, a dish whose fate tells the story of a vanished city and a vanished way of eating. For over a century, jellied eels defined London's East End, their slippery coils glistening in glass cases at pie and mash shops from Bow to Bermondsey. The man's family ledger, kept in a back office above Tower Bridge Road, once recorded queues stretching out the door on Saturday mornings, 30,000 plates sold each year in the 1950s, every one a badge of local pride. Eels, pulled live from the Thames and chopped while still wriggling, were boiled with parsley and cooled until the liquor set to a trembling jelly. The taste, briny, sharp with malt vinegar, a hint of river mud, divided the city. Children dared each other to swallow a whole piece. Old men, caps pulled low, ate them with silent reverence, a ritual older than the tube lines beneath their feet. Housewives carried home paper-wrapped bundles for Friday supper, the scent of vinegar and cold fish lingering in the stairwells of council flats. Wartime diaries recall eels as a rare bounty when rationing bit hardest, a protein that kept the East End standing when beef and bacon vanished from the shops. But the river changed. By the 1980s, pollution and overfishing had cut the Thames eel population by 95%, a collapse as dramatic as any industrial disaster. European Union quotas followed, tightening each year, until the shops that survived did so on imported Dutch stock. The Manzi ledger tells the rest. By the 2010s, barely 2,000 plates sold each year, the old regulars gone, replaced by tourists snapping photos of a curiosity. The taste of jellied eels faded from daily life, surviving only in memory and the occasional heritage pop-up. The dish's disappearance is more than a matter of appetite. It marks the loss of a whole world, a network of shops, riverside markets, and family rituals swept away by environmental change and the slow drift of culture. Yet for those who remember, jellied eels remain the taste of a city that once fed itself from its own river, proud and unpretentious, now nearly extinct. The story ends not with a ban or a scandal, but with silence. The empty counter, the ledger closed, the river too empty to give up its catch. From the humble plowman's lunch to the near-extinct jellied eels, our journey through 25 lost British meals reveals more than just changing tastes. At the top of the list, dishes like faggots and peas and jellied eels vanished almost overnight due to dramatic supply collapse and sweeping food regulations, reminding us how policy and environment can reshape a nation's table. Midway, classics like Toad in the Hole and Bubble and Squeak faded as home cooking gave way to ready meals, convenience, and shifting health trends. Throughout, a consistent pattern emerges. These meals disappeared not from lack of love, but from a collision of supermarket strategies, health campaigns, and the decline of local food traditions. Each entry earned its place by showing a clear, well-documented drop in everyday life, whether through statistics or regulatory shock. In the end, these vanished dishes are more than recipes. They're a record of British resilience, thrift, and changing identity. The story of these meals is the story of Britain itself, evolving with every bite left behind.